Welcome back to Gold Derby. I'm Christopher Rosen. I'm so pleased to be joined by Emmy Award nominee Jim Frohna, a prolific cinematographer whose latest project is the Apple TV Plus comedy series Shrinking. Jim, I love this show. I love a lot of your work. You've worked on so many incredible shows, probably maybe most famously Transparent, but obviously like The Chair, Big Little Lies, I Love Dick, Somebody Somewhere. And now Shrinking, I guess, what was it about this series, I guess, for you that, set it apart from previous stuff that you've done in terms of wanting to do it and taking on the challenge?
Sure. Well, again, thank you for having me on. And when I first of all, I have to start with Ted Lasso because, like many people, I love that show. And as soon as I heard, I got even a little bit of wind that there was another show from some of the creators of Ted Lasso. I thought that's the place that I want to put my energy. It's a show that shrinking like Ted Lasso goes to many places, right? You laugh out loud and then you suddenly get a sock in the gut or you feel things and you're, tearing up. And that sort of attachment to the humanity of it, right? You can laugh, but you can also feel things. And in fact, in my first, interview, my Zoom interview with some of the producers of Shrinking, I just said, Ted Lasso saved me and my family during the pandemic. And from there, just hearing about what they wanted and how it was different than Lasso, and that we were going to be able to mine this real, story of a man, a father who lost his wife, and the repercussions of that loss and grief. And again, at the same time, we're going to be laughing, and Harrison Ford's going to show up as Jimmy's mentor. It was sort of a very complete package, and the kind of stories that I want to be telling as a DP.
It's incredible stuff, and I totally agree. As a fan of Ted Lasso, I was like, yes, this show seems like something I would like. I guess one of the challenges, I guess, for you then, and especially someone who watched Ted Lasso, and like you said, there are similarities, at least like superficially. How did you like kind of make it look and stand out on its own visually compared to like Ted Lasso? Because I think people probably, especially because they're both on Apple, if they're watching Ted Lasso, they're gonna like like in the old days, this maybe would have been a show that would have been on with Ted Lasso, right? When people watch network TV and stuff, and
Right, right,
they
right.
used to pair things together that were like. So I was like, I do think it's like really interesting that they're connected in like I said, superficial ways. But I guess for you, how did you make it stand out and try to look differently visually? And obviously, it's a different story, so that probably helps. But I mean, like in general, I
Yeah.
guess like how'd you kind of approach that?
Yeah, well, I think, one thing that James Ponsoldt, who's, directed the pilot and is one of the executive producers, we talked about what can be the container for this show. And it's got, again, this range of experiences of emotions from the slapstick, to the pathos and the real pain. And what we kind of landed on, and what I think that I bring to a lot of my work is this sort of groundedness and this like these are real people going through real things. Yes, it can get silly at times, but this is a real place. This is Pasadena, and obviously the setting helped too, very, very different from Ted Lasso, but essentially it was an exploration of you know what can hold all the wide range of feelings in this show. And that was what we kind of landed on, was it wants to feel authentic and real and grounded, and that's what we set out to achieve.
Did you like obviously the show you like tracks like kind of we meet like Jimmy Jason Segel's character like at a very nadir, let's say, right? Like his wife has been dead for a year. He's kind of spun out, and then like the remainder of the show is basically like his recovery or like slowly coming back to like obviously like it doesn't end on a note of complete reconciliation or anything, but I mean, like he's obviously like in a better place in the
Hmm.
beginning at the end of the show than at the beginning, even though
Sure,
that has created its own consequences and complications that we will
sure.
hopefully explore in the next season. But I guess
Yeah,
for you then visually, how did you kind of map his growth and like all of the characters kind of go through these different things, and I guess how did you kind of think of it from where you guys started with the first episode to visually how kind of like it ends up?
sure. Well, as you mentioned, I mean, Jimmy starts in a very dark place, and we sort of, it may sound a little simplistic, but we just kind of embrace that in terms of, he's literally sitting in the dark corner of the kitchen at times, and you know, even though it's fairly subtle in his office, there's sunlight that will hit his patients, but never him in those earlier episodes, right? And then eventually more sun, will grow. And even our, set decorator Andrea Fenton had this idea that the plants in Jimmy's office would be withered at the beginning. And again, it's very subtle; it's on the edges of the frame, but things come back to life in many ways on many layers of the show as the season progresses. There's also a scene in the pilot when the sun first hits Jimmy. It's this glaring, harsh morning sun that's pouring through the kitchen window as his daughter is cleaning up the mess from his, previous night. And uh, it was sort of an idea that I went for, and Jason walked in to rehearse the scene, and he was like, "This is so perfect because like he literally has to he kind of recoils. It's that sort of that feeling you get when you've been inside and then you step out into the bright California sun or anywhere, and it's just a little bit too much. So that when the sun hits him, it's a bit too much, and that's kind of like the one, as I'm recalling now, like the one big moment of him facing the light
Yeah,
in the
that
pilot. So yeah, so it's I don't know if viewers would notice necessarily, but that was sort of our doorway into the journey visually.
I mean, maybe they would notice like in outright, but I think they probably would feel it, right? Like that kind of thing. That's what you're
Yes. Oh
hoping,
yeah.
I'd
Oh
imagine
yeah.
too. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm actually a huge proponent of that. It's why we savor, when there's a show that goes to such great details. Like, I mean, I don't know if you were a fan of Mad Men, or that's a generally beloved show, but like the meticulousness and the detail of that show, like every little thing added up. I mean, that show sort of feasted on that and made it one of its primary missions. But I'm using that as an example to say, like, even if you don't know that that magazine sitting on the table over there is from 1959 or whatever, like, the audience can feel that. I
Hmm.
do believe in that kind of thing, and so yeah, even when it's subtle, it's like it adds to the whole experience, right?
I agree with that too. And Mad Men was one of my favorites, so I totally
Oh yeah,
totally on
yeah,
that wavelength as well. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, like you mentioned, like James Ponsoldt did the pilot. I think you worked with four different filmmakers, right, for this
yeah.
show, but you shot every episode. And
That's
I guess
correct.
so as cinematographer, like are you like how does your role change with each of the directors and like kind of like how do you like I mean obviously you've done a lot of TV like you said at the beginning so it's not like new for you to have to work with different people on the same
Right.
show or whatever but I guess how did in this case how did that work and how do you kind of like are you are basically like you're kind of like are you in charge of like making sure the new people who come in are kind of like picking up the baton from the previous person I guess and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, between myself and the showrunner, that we're the, and obviously there's the script supervisor who's going to make sure so there are people who are watching out for that kind of thing. Is this in the language of our show? Yes, much of it falls to me as the person, making shots with the director. Um, I actually have always enjoyed that part of my job in TV, because I get to work with many different directors who come with different styles or different ways of speaking about shots, and it's in the past I've likened it to kind of speed dating because it's like I'm with this person for 10 days or 6 days or whatever it is, and I'm all in, and then I have to kind of turn around and like, okay, now who is this new person? How do I communicate with them? How do they, what is their mode of conversation or communication about shots and ideas and feelings of scenes and that kind of thing? And all in all, it works out very well. And again, it's sort of one of the novel aspects of my job, and I enjoy it.
Yeah. Do you mention like obviously like so much of the show is in the like in the therapist office, like in those subtle details with the lighting, like you were talking about before, and also a lot of the interaction with like Jason Harrison and Jessica's in their break room and stuff. And I guess like these are like kind of like very basic settings, right? Like office settings. And I guess like how did you make sure like it looked great? Like I guess just basically that. Like I think those scenes look like really good, and there's probably a million different ways you could have tried to make them look good but how did you kind of like reconcile the sets with like how you wanted to look visually and make sure it was kind
Sure.
of like connected?
Yeah. Well, in terms of kind of like I said earlier, like the idea that it's very grounded and naturalistic, right? So the feeling wants to be like that we are actually, even though those are sets, we want to feel like it's the actual daylight coming into these offices, and so with my gaffer Paul Samaniego and we kind of, even though we were on stage, we kind of said, well, in real life, because this was modeled after an actual building that we see a couple times in exterior, um, we said, okay, if it's a 10 a.m. appointment, where is the sun? Or, and so just so we had a kind of logic to follow if we wanted to. And then, of course, it could be like, well, when Jimmy first, encounters Sean, it's later in the day, but we wanted to kind of be that marine layer, kind of more overcast Pasadena feeling. Um, and so we did have a sun path
Hmm.
that kind of kept us, true, we'll say. And then creatively, we could, I could make decisions based on what is the feeling in the scene. But that's pretty much how we did it. And I think having something like that when you're returning to like the break room set, it's it's a good way. It's a good foundation.
Mhm.
And then the other thing that completely throws all that out is that in Jessica's office, the sun was always shining because her character has that brightness. I mean, it's in her wardrobe, it's in the decor of her office, and she just brings it. So it's like, oh yeah, the sun always finds her. So
That's
that's kind of how we approach
that's
this.
awesome. I really like that. Yeah. I guess like I don't know, like the one of the things you mentioned, like you mentioned Jessica there. I was thinking this before I wrote it down. I was like, I guess in my as I watched a million things, I've seen a lot of people in cars, right? There's a couple of scenes where Jessica and Harrison are singing or Jessica's singing in a car.
Yeah.
And recently I've just become very cognizant of like I don't think it looks always very good, but on you did such a great I feel like it looks like real like when people are in cars. I don't know whether it's like I have an old my memory is different or whatever. I'm like when I was a kid, these things used to look better. People shooting in cars, and I
Hmm.
feel like it looks great in Shrinking. I do think it looks awesome. And I guess how'd you do it to make it look better than like I've seen it on a million other things recently? Because I just think
Well,
that's like become a challenge maybe for people, and I don't
yeah.
understand.
Well,
It's
it's
great.
interesting. Yeah, it's funny that you kind of picked up on that, or I share your perspective on that in terms of other shows. So much of car work is done with LED screens now, or it would be blue screen, and then they put an image in later, and this kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier of all the little details of things or the textures of things, and I'm always pushing for shooting in a a car that's actually driving down a street. And the downside of that is it takes a lot more time, and in TV you often don't have time, and so you just have to make choices in the face of certain things, like, oh, this is a 3-page dialogue scene. It would take us 2 days to shoot this out in the real world. We have to do something. So it's not always as simple as like, oh, what I want, right? But when possible, and I'm always going to start from the place of let's drive this thing. And actually on this show, what we did was we found a couple streets on the Warner Brothers lot. They have like this on the back lot, a neighborhood, and then there's sort of a little bit of some corporate buildings that actually belong, it's part of Warner Brothers, but you don't feel like you're driving through a back lot. You don't see sound stages and that kind of thing. So it just worked out that those scenes were short enough that it timed out just the length of those roads. But it just, again, like the way that light flickers through the car, or just the feeling of actually driving has a quality to it, and I think I like to think that that's what you're responding to.
It definitely was, and I'm not like it really was. I just was like I've seen it so many times, and I'm like, oh man, like it just doesn't like you said. Like I understand there's blue screen involved, and a lot of times I'm not asking you to like critique, and I can't even think of specifics really, but I'm just like,
Yeah.
wow, like it definitely stood out on Shrinking, where I was like, this looks like legit. Like they're in this. I felt like I believe they were in this car and they're driving on a street, and it just like you said, it kind of lends to the reality of the show and kind of like keeps it doesn't pull you out of it. I guess as a viewer, which I found like
Yeah.
really great for
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
Awesome.
You,
Great.
I want to ask you. Obviously, mentioned like having Harrison Ford on the show, and you have these great performances. I guess, like I'm sure you've been asked this before, but like, what was it like? I mean, like, what surprised you? I guess about Harrison Ford as an actor, maybe that you were not expecting. I'm sure you've like
Mhm.
obviously like everybody else is a huge fan of his work and has seen everything. So I guess like, but
Sure.
what surprised you getting to actually work with him directly?
Yeah. Well, I will say that, I grew up in Milwaukee. I was the kid who was in line every morning, to get the best seats to see Raiders of the Lost Ark or whatever it was. Like day, I'd go to the same movie like days in a row, and so to grow up and suddenly find myself, pointing a camera at Harrison Ford there in the room across from me, and most of us had that kind of feeling, right? Again, it's like it's not hard to imagine. There were a lot of huge fans, and so first of all, we just all had to get over the fact that there was Han Solo sitting in a therapist chair. But what the surprise was, first of all, he's a really great guy. He's actually very down to earth, and he loves being on a set. He loves crew. He has such a respect for the process and for the hard workers, on the crew. And he just likes to sit around and shoot the shit. Like he would just hang out, and talk to the boom guy during, a break, or hang out with the wardrobe people, or whatever it was. Like the, because it struck me, it's like he turned 80 while we were filming. He obviously gets paid well enough that he probably doesn't have to, hasn't had to work for a while, but he obviously loves it. And so I think, just, he was very much a mensch. He was just like a good guy who who cared a lot about what he was doing, and obviously also very funny in that character, and that was a real treat to see. But you know, again, just having the beautiful surprise of like, he's a good dude who, you know, like we're all just here working our, you know, doing our best, and he's one of us, kind of feeling.
I wanted to wrap up here then, I guess briefly, and you mentioned earlier like you were such a fan of Ted Lasso, and like obviously like Bill Lawrence and Brett involved in the show. So now having done it, I guess like, you know, how did the experience like kind of compare to like what you had hoped, I guess, when you first had that meeting,
Yeah,
basically?
yeah. I have to say that, you know, the experience of making the show and then watching it lived up to my hopes and expectations, and you know, the thrill I had when I, you know, got offered the job, because we did get to tell a story of people really dealing with, you know, suffering and grief, and also bring a lot of hopefulness to the situation. And it's really about a group of people who are ultimately watching out for each other. And given a lot of things that happen in the world these days, it's like it's a comfort, and I don't think it's a superficial one. I think it actually really does go to a deeper place in the viewers, in me. It did when we were making it, and when I watched it, you know, that it's like we have to watch out for each other, and that's what that show is, you know,
Yeah,
ultimately. Yeah.
I agree. I think there's an authenticity to the emotions that feels not like phony, right? And I think you could sense that when you're watching it. So it is a great show, and hopefully, I mean, I'm sure you'll be back for season 2. I hope. I know they announced the season 2.
They announced it, and you know, we're all waiting to, you know, see what happens with the strike and everything
Mhm.
like that. But you know, that's the dream and the goal and the hope.
Yeah, same. I'm excited as a viewer. I'm excited, and Jim, your work on the show is incredible. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Christopher. Have a great day.